All right, hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Mohammed Khalil, the Director of the Muslim Studies program here at Michigan State. And we're delighted to have you all here with us for this noon lecture by Professor Kirsten Fermaglich. The title of the lecture is Islamophobia and Muslim Name Changing After 9/11. And wow, this is like, it was just
God.
It's amazing.
What let out? Something let out.
Oh man, okay, how about that? Okay. All right. Welcome. All are welcome. All are welcome. Professor Isa, I'm guessing he's the professor of this class? Yes? Thank you, Professor Isa.
Thank you.
Come on in, come on in. All right. This is like doubled up real quickly. Okay. So, welcome to you all, and let me introduce our guest speaker, Professor Kirsten Fermaglich. She's a guest speaker, but she's from Michigan State. So she's
That's right,
still
I'm not that
a guest
fancy.
speaker. Yeah.
I'm not that fancy. I cost no money.
So Professor Kirsten Fermaglich is an associate professor of history here at Michigan State, and has been teaching history and Jewish studies at MSU since 2001. Her interests center around the historical meanings and problematic nature of ethnic identity in the United States. Her first book, American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, published by Brandeis University Press in 2006, looked at secular Jewish intellectuals' uses of the Holocaust in the early 1960s. Her most recent book, which you'll learn about today, entitled A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, explores the history of name changing in the United States in the 20th century. She also co-edited with Professor Lisa Fine the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kirsten Fermaglich.
So thank you so much, everybody, for coming, for this class. I'm really, this is awesome. And thank you to Mohammed for inviting me to do this. This is a talk that I've wanted to give for a couple of years. I'm a professor of Jewish history and Jewish studies, not Muslim or Islamic history, so I'm really sort of dipping into this based on the materials that I found. So I really welcome whatever anybody wants to offer for me. I'm really kind of coming at it as a novice, but I'm really happy to have anybody who has any kind of experience or knowledge with Muslim or Arabic sounding names. My research is on name changing. This is my recent book, which is about name changing, and it comes from that. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to start the talk, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and how this fits into my larger project. And then I'm going to go a little bit more into depth, and then hopefully we'll have some really good questions and answers. Good questions anyway. I can't promise the answers will be good, but I hopefully will be. So let me just get started. And I should also say that I realized that my title is a little bit different from the title of either the book or the sign, which I realized said "In America," right? And I sort of make my book very much about America. In fact, it's mostly New York, and that's something that I'm actually really open to people talking about differences or similarities in New York versus other parts of the country. That's something that definitely keep in mind. My research base is mostly New York. Okay, I just want to get that out of the way. All right, so I'm going to give you this. In 2002, a 24-year-old man named Rayam Azad Youssef petitioned the civil court of the city of New York to allow him to change his name to Ray Savant. That's the actual petition and what it looks like. On page 2, so they're quite standardized at this point. They look like this, they give the name, what you want to change it to. They ask questions mostly about whether you've ever committed fraud, whether you have any child support that you have to pay, any reason that a name change might, that you might be trying to escape some kind of obligation. That's what the first page looks like. And then the second page asks you why. What are the grounds for this application? And then they leave a blank. Youssef, who became Savant, answered that the grounds of this application are to safeguard my liberty in my pursuit of happiness and to best represent my culture and allegiances. Okay, this is 2002. Azad was not alone. During this year, in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center, 18% of the name change petitions submitted to the court to erase an ethnic sounding name came from petitioners with names that sounded Muslim or Arabic or Middle Eastern in some way. That number was far disproportionate to both the number of Muslim New Yorkers, which is about 6.6% of the population, and frankly incorporates a lot of African American Muslims who are very distinguishable, and I frequently sort of kept them out of the numbers of the numbers that I was counting, and then Arab New Yorkers, which is about 1%, right? So it's at least 3 times, or roughly 3 times the numbers of Muslim New Yorkers and Arabic New Yorkers. Azab and his fellow New Yorkers changed their names in the midst of a wave of Islamophobia after 9/11. And I'm gonna offer you a picture. This was actually really, I was looking for pictures for this, and this one, actually I found a lot of pictures that I tried to avoid after September 11th. I selected this one in particular, in part because I do want to sort of highlight the New York elements of this. I did my research in the actual court where people changed their names, which was several blocks away from the World Trade Center. So every day when I came in to do my research, and every day when people went to go do this name changing, they were doing so only a few blocks away from where this devastation had taken place. And where 3 of the officers who checked our bags through every day were killed because they went to go recover and help people. So I show you this picture to sort of suggest sort of the depth of this happening and why New York is so important, right? And why this location is so important, and the fact that people are changing their names right there is pretty meaningful. So they are changing their name in the wake of a wave of Islamophobia that is created by this that is sparked by some of the feelings and emotions that come in the wake of this devastation. In 2001, hate crimes against Muslim Americans, in one report that I've seen, represented 27% of all religious-based hate crimes reported. And there are reports that within days after the attacks in 2001, the hate crimes spiked against people of Muslim and Arab descent. Journalists, lawyers, and scholars reported that families were contemplating moving, that individuals were being harassed at checkpoints while flying and driving, and that Muslims were considering changing their names. And this is just a few things, and I'll offer some more evidence and some more material later on. But clearly, particularly right after September 11th, there's clearly a wave. Reports seem to suggest that the numbers went down, and that's something that I'm going to talk about later after several months, that the numbers went down. And I'm going to talk about that and significance, but also not significance in sort of considering name changing. But I want to let you know, and this is how this fits into my book, Arab and Muslim name changing in response to hatred and ethnic hatred and religious hatred is not a brand new phenomenon. In the middle of the 20th century, Jews changed their names in large numbers for very similar reasons in very similar ways. So that gets me to sort of the larger project, and I do want to explain that because that is where the bulk of my work comes from. So I wrote this book for 12 years. It took a long time. I looked through name change petitions in this court for over a century, from 1887 to 2012. So I looked through thousands and thousands of petitions, actually. The court, I need to thank the court. They were very open in letting me do this. I'm happy to talk with you. If anybody here does any kind of social scientific sampling, I'm happy to talk with you about the methodology that I used. I'm not actually a quantitative scholar for the most part, but I can explain. So it was actually work for me to learn how to do this, but I'm happy to talk with you about sort of how I selected the materials I selected, how I decided what a Jewish name was, or what a Muslim or an Arabic or a Middle Eastern sounding name was. It's kind of, I'm happy to talk with you about all of this, and it would be an interesting question. But so I looked through, thousands of petitions. And what I found, and this was partially what I was looking for, but not entirely. I was actually fairly open. I was trained as a US historian. And even though I do work as a Jewish historian, I was looking for everybody. But what I did actually find was that Jewish New Yorkers were far and disproportionately represented in these petitions throughout the middle of the 20th century, really starting after World War I, spiking during World War II, and then really continuing all the way through the 60s and 70s. Jews are actually disproportionately represented in these files. And they are mostly doing so, and they're doing so in really interesting ways that are kind of distinct, certainly don't look like any contemporary population name changing now. So this is just one example. You can see this is a little different. The form changes, right, over time. It used to be that you had lawyers do it, and it was a little bit more official, and you had to sit in front of a court. I'm just going to give you one example to give you a sense of what they looked like, so you can see some similarities and differences in the ways that Muslims are changing their names now, and the ways that Jews did so 70 years ago. So he sort of goes through, there are all these lists of what he does, but it's the kind of same thing here. This says the grounds for this application are as follows, and here are the list of the grounds of applications he follows. The name Greenberger is a foreign-sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician. Another ground was that the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing, and I should say his daughter was trying to become a musician. So Max Greenberg is not only changing his own name to Max Green, he's changing his daughter's name to Green as well, and he's also changing his son's name to Green because he wants to be an intern in a hospital. He's in medical school. And what this really reflects is that the years after World War I see the rise of an anti-Semitic, what I call an anti-Semitic regime in the United States, where Jews are specifically and very carefully and institutionally discriminated against. People create application forms to figure out who Jews are. Among the things they ask on those application forms are, have you ever changed your name? Because they understand that Jews are changing their name. And they are very literally and consciously and explicitly trying to keep Jews out of particular jobs, out of particular schools, out of, even really applying for employment agencies, really, not even the jobs themselves, but employment agencies are instructed to use these kinds of forms and never to let Jewish applicants come through. And in addition to this, and I'll show you, actually I can give you some images. The images come after my argument, I'm sorry. So okay, that is setting this up. So I'll give you the argument and then I'll give you some additional evidence. So what I would say though is that Jews are doing this. They are facing significant anti-Semitism, which exposes them to ridicule, and I'll give some of those examples later on, particularly during World War II, and sometimes violence. And limiting their educational and job possibilities. Name changing helped them to find jobs, to get into schools, and to avoid humiliation, but at a price. And I don't really talk much about that price in this talk, but I'm happy to talk more about it if you want to ask what I mean by that. There is a price to it that is both individual and also communal. I'm not going to talk about that, but if you want to write in your notes, if that intrigues you, feel free to ask me and I'll talk about what I mean by that. Muslims at the beginning of the 21st century have faced similar Islamophobia, with similar impact on their economic and social daily lives. It's not necessarily as institutionally constructed and careful as the anti-Semitism was of the 1920s and 30s, where really there's an entire, literally a system, and I'll show you, application forms that are purposely constructed to figure out who the Jews are. So that's not necessarily happening today. However, Muslims are absolutely reporting having trouble finding jobs, being targeted, sort of changing names to be able to face or sort of move in and out through discrimination. And in the immediate wake of the 9/11 attacks, many Muslim New Yorkers changed their names with petitions that really eloquently expressed their anxieties. And you might want to think a little bit about the differences in language between the petition that I gave you of Greenberger and the petition of Ray Savant. And I'll show you some other petitions that will sort of equally express that kind of difference. But, and this is another important difference, so one difference is kind of the sound of the petitions. There are other differences in sort of numbers and time frame. So Jews, it lasts a really long time, right? It's from 1917 all the way through after World War II. Name changing is really only a temporary phenomenon, as far as I can tell, for New Yorkers with Muslim or Arabic sounding names. Unlike Jews who do it for decades, Muslim New Yorkers stopped changing their names only a few years. And I am going to argue for you that I think that's in response to intensified surveillance and racialization of Muslim New Yorkers, which is, although Jews themselves are also facing racialization, it is different. And the level of surveillance that Muslims face, I think, is at least in part why you don't see Muslim Americans continuing this kind of trend that you might imagine that had that surveillance not existed, that we might have seen more people attempting to kind of use this. There are a lot of similarities between Muslims and Jews in terms of their relationship to sort of whiteness, right? An ability to sort of be seen as middle class and white and to use a different name as a way of sort of escaping discrimination. But because of surveillance, it is not as possible for Muslim Americans and Muslim New Yorkers. So that's going to be the argument that I'm going to offer for you, and I'll give you more evidence for that. Okay, so I'll let room for, if this were my class, I would give you questions, I would let you ask questions now, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to go all the way through, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. So let me give you just a little bit, I've already sort of offered for you some images of anti-Semitism in the 20th century, but let me give you a few arguments about this, and then I'm going to show you some images to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This is supposed to go 1, 2, 3, that's okay. So Jews are seen as an alien religion and this is going to sound familiar, and I've constructed this to sound familiar to Muslims today, right? They're an alien religion with racialized features. They have different names, which are seen as very identifiable as only their kinds of names, and seen as looking different as well. So things like Jewish noses, Jewish hair, Jewish body types were all things that were pointed out. So people in two people in my American Jewish history class will know we've looked at a lot of images of what Jews are supposed to look like that have highlighted their physical features, right? Large noses, right? And this should, again, sound familiar in terms of Muslim Americans, but it is pretty similar for Jews at this time, right? They are seen as either being communist or as being overly capitalist, right? Either way, they are greedy and they are taking your money and they are getting you into war, right? That's one vision of Jews. Or they're communists and they're going to destroy the country because they're going to radicalize it and they're going to destroy it, right? So those are, warring features, but nonetheless both are seen as the alien features that are going to take over America and destroy it. And thousands of Jews in New York City change their names because they can't find jobs or get into school. So these kinds of images that show up in pop culture actually show up practically in people's daily lives, the kinds of stuff that they are faced with every day as they try to imagine how they're going to live their lives, right? In the position that many of you are in, right? I want to go to school, I want to get a job. That is exactly where they are, and they are finding themselves increasingly hemmed in because of their names frequently, right? And this private discrimination is permitted and even sometimes committed by the government, right? So I'm going to show you actually the next thing. I think the next slide I have for you will really highlight this, right? Like it is open and above board to be discriminating and the government completely allows it. And I have found some evidence that at least some city agencies are doing the similar thing. So this is a help wanted ad from the 1930s in a New York newspaper. And I don't know if you can see it well, but a number of these events. And this is, you would look, you're looking for a job. People here, maybe seniors, you're looking for a job. You'd go, at that time, you would go to the newspaper to look in the help wanted ads. And in fact, many of the jobs would say Christian. Christian, there's one, it doesn't show up here because this is too large. There's one that says Protestant on this. High-type Americans is also frequently sort of a way to identify that you don't want someone of an ethnic or background. But clearly, there are things. There are no laws that make this illegal, right? Like when I talk about this with my students, everybody's shocked, right? Because like this is illegal now, right? You can't say what kind of religion somebody should be for a job. But at this moment, nobody's protesting this. And so that suggests sort of the larger sort of regime of discrimination. You also see that there are all over America at this moment, there are rumors and songs and propaganda, especially during World War II, that blame Jews for getting into the war. Here, I'll show you this. So this is a pamphlet. This is a language of pamphlet that you might have found if you got onto a subway, or you picked up a defense industry pamphlet, which a lot of people are working in because it's during the war. So first American killed in Pearl Harbor, John J. Hennessy. First pilot to sink a Jap ship, apologies for the racist term, but this was the term that they were using at that time during the war. Colin P. Kelly, first American to sink a Jap ship with torpedo, John Buckley, greatest American war air hero, Butch O'Hare, first American killed at Guadalcanal, John J. O'Brien, first American to get 4 new tires, Abraham Lipschitz, right? So clearly, and this varies, like you might see this in all different kinds of places throughout the country. It's like, it's not official. This is something that just kind of spreads around like a dirty joke, right? But it's published, right? So you can see it various places. It's kind of out there. The names change, but they're always Irish or English or American sounding. And then the last person is always someone who is benefiting from the war, right? Who's not contributing to war service, who is actually benefiting, profiteering from the war, getting 4 new tires. That may sound strange to you, but in fact, during the war, you couldn't get new tires, right? All the rubber is rationed because it's needed for the war industry. So this is somebody who's benefiting from the war, right? Which nobody else is. And he has a name that is a distinctively Jewish name. Again, this name always changes, right? But it's always a Jewish name. Right, so Jews are seeing this, and they are faced with these kinds of charges that they are, right, and this also suggests not only they're profiteering, but they're not serving, and that they've gotten America into the war because of Nazi Germany, and that they are not actually fighting themselves. veterans, soldiers and veterans of the war by 1946 are 40% of the name changers, right? Men who are serving in the military are feeling pressure from their peers, from their officers, from various people, that their names in particular are identifying them as Jews and making them suspect and questioned. And they are particularly changing their names because of that kind of anxiety in the social situation they're facing. Okay, and so there you see things like this. And this actually, this petition, I'm just gonna give you one more petition to look at the language. There are not a lot of petitions like this, but there are petitions like this where people actually go through their job search, right? In Chicago, Deponent tried to find work, found it was a handicap to have a name such as Applebaum. It was then the petitioner decided to seek another name which was easier to pronounce and shorter, and adopted the name of Cronin. And immediately thereafter, petition did obtain a position, right? So it doesn't always work, but it does work, right? Like you see people sort of saying, this is working, right? I'm gonna keep using this, and this is not alone. It's not the dominant, but definitely this exists, right? People will say, I tried this, it didn't work, this name got me a job. It really does kind of indicate that people are not just afraid because they're worried, like it actually is true, right? They are being perceived as a different, dangerous, undesirable race, and that eliminating their name helps them to be doing the basic things they need to be doing to get through life. Okay, so I want to compare this to Islamophobia in the 21st century. So after 2001, New Yorkers who are Muslim or had Arabic ancestry are facing economic and social discrimination. They are seen as an alien religion with racialized features, different names, different appearances that are seeking to overtake American values. And they too are changing their names in disproportionately high numbers. So I will give you some of the evidence of people sort of feeling this way. A lot of it is anecdotal in terms of people changing their names, how anecdotal this is, but absolutely the ways that names play into the way people are sort of perceiving Islamophobia are significant. So Dalia Hisa, who's a lawyer working for an Arab American Family Support Network, says, we've heard that families have packed up and left, that people are thinking of changing their names. A lot of people now think that if their name is Omar or Muhammad or Osama, something clearly Muslim, they'll never get anywhere in this country anymore. In 2011, Entertainment Weekly published an article on Islamophobia in the entertainment world, which said, producers to Middle Eastern actors, this is the title, producers to Middle Eastern actors, don't tell anyone your real name or you'll never work in this town again. And that was actually sort of something that someone who was Arab American had been told, right, as he changed his name. Other articles report on people who've changed their names to make their coworkers more comfortable. The Guardian publishes a story on a financial executive who changes his name to Daniel Jacob. I think his name was Tariq Ahmad, and he changes his name to Daniel Jacob, ironically kind of a Jewish-sounding name, in order to be able to succeed. So there's a whole host of sort of stories like this. So comedian Ahmed sort of jokes it's a bad time to be named Ahmed right now after he's been handcuffed in a Las Vegas airport because his name matched that of an Al-Qaeda operative, and thinking certainly about watch lists and the ways that bureaucracy and surveillance are sort of working specifically towards Islamic names is really important at this moment, right? I don't talk about it a lot in this lecture particularly, but there is absolutely an upsurge of sort of just bureaucratic checking of names, right? And a lot of that does have to do with the creation of watch lists, and that kind of intensified attention to names absolutely helps to contribute to anxieties about Arabic names. So I will say that everyone in my petitions at this moment in 2002 is being asked to give like every single version of their name because they are so crazy about like any kind of spelling of it. But the most intense sort of example of that I have found was a woman named Habiba, whose name was Habiba, and had to change it to add an H to the end of it, Habiba with an H at the end of it, which is a transliteration, which makes no sense, right? But the reason is because a clerk demanded it, because she was Habiba without an H and with an H, and that was not good enough, so she had to change her name officially in order to be able to fit these kind of bureaucratic measurements, right? So this is an important element of what happens after 9/11, both Islamophobia and also surveillance. And so what this means, and I just want to give you a little bit more of detail of numbers here. In 2002, more than 60% of all Muslim and Arabic sounding names in the court are erased because petitioners feared Islamophobic backlash, which is a very high number, right? Which really suggests that this is at least in 2002, this is really dominating a good portion of Arabic and Muslim petitioners to the court, and by representation, people in New York City who are afraid of what this is going to mean for their lives. And here, I'll give you some examples of some of them. I've never felt comfortable with my name because of the difficulty. This is Bouzid Mubarak Azam, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, who changes his name to Robert George Marcone. I've never felt comfortable with my name because of the difficulty in pronouncing it and with the backlash against Arabic-sounding names such as mine since September 11th. It has only increased my personal stress, anxiety, and discomfort. There's another one. This is the name change petition of Ibrahim Antonello Castronova. Petitioner prefers the name Rosario Antonello Castronova. The basis for this is that prevailing attitudes and prejudices against persons of Arabic descendancy have been adversely affected as a direct result of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Petitioner wishes to change his name to a less demonstratively Muslim Arabic first name. And important to note, people ask me sometimes first, last names, particularly with Muslim names, it doesn't matter at all. It's actually both very equally. It's actually even true for Jews, which people might think is less the case, and it's not always people changing their names from names like, Moses or names that are, Moshe or things that are very explicitly Jewish, but actually even names like, Hyman, for example, which is a very common sort of English-sounding name to represent a Hebrew name, winds up becoming a name that a lot of Jews get rid of as that becomes typed as a Jewish name. So you can see the ways, and I do encourage you, and I'm happy to talk more about the ways that this language is very evocative, really talks about discrimination in a really evocative way. Not mostly true for Jews, who mostly do not mention anti-Semitism at all. They talk about not being able to get jobs, but they almost never talk about things like this as explicitly. And I think that does represent kind of a moment that we're in where people feel more comfortable talking about ethnic identity, they feel more comfortable talking about racism than I think Jews felt at this moment. It is worth noting, I didn't put them on the PowerPoint, however, that there are a good number of Muslim and Arabic name changes that sound a lot more like the Jewish ones. I've always liked this other name. I don't want to, I like this name Tony. I've always admired it and I want it, or I think it might be easier for me to get a job. That kind of stuff exists also. I'm giving you some of the most, I think, poignant and really powerful petitions, but there are others as well. So in an era championing multiculturalism, Muslim and Arab Americans have felt more comfortable describing discrimination than Jews did in the 1930s and 40s. But importantly, and this is sort of finally what I want to say, it does not remain a lasting phenomenon as it did for Jews. Part of the reason for this may be that, there's a spike in hate crimes in 2001, and then there's a decline. And people say that this may have been because people, addressed Islamophobia very well, right? They got in and tried to fight things down. Bush, sort of exerted leadership and saying, Muslims are Americans and things like that. So that might be a part of it. I actually argue, however, that specifically in this case, and this is why I want to make a point about New York versus America, I don't know about specifically what's going on in America, the New York Police Department in the months after 9/11 creates a surveillance program that actually has been in the news fairly recently because they actually just had to apologize for it and do, sort of pay out for it and promise not to do it again. In 2002, I have the date for you actually, in 2000, let me try and find it, here we go. In January 2002, a former CIA official, David Cohen, became the NYPD's first civilian intelligence official and began to train police officers with Arabic and Muslim backgrounds to go undercover into communities in New York and in New Jersey, actually, to go to mosques and restaurants and grocery stores and basically to infiltrate, to surveil these communities. And they are actually doing so with the explicit intent to create fear, actually. I mean, they sort of say, and this is particularly important for me, because actually in 2008, they actually begin using my petitions. They actually go to the civil court and they ask for they ask for the petitions. They begin to compile a database of the petitions. They begin to interview people who ask for name changes, and they do it kind of in the way they do airport checks, right? So they do it randomly, right? So, you know, if you're a white Jew, you might get called upon, but really every person who's got any kind of Arabic or Muslim name, they are definitely being interviewed, right? So they are using these specific name change petitions as a means of surveilling. And I think what that does is send a message to people that you shouldn't change your name. Or at least if you change your name, it's not going to be effective, right? You are not going to escape any kind of scrutiny. In fact, it might bring more scrutiny upon you to change your name than to not change your name. So why would you do that, right? So I think that the surveillance by the time of, so I only looked at petitions every 5 years. So I looked 2002, 2007, 2012. And by 2007 and 2012, that spike that I described has gone down. So Arab and Muslim name changers look no different from other name changers. They don't have this kind of distinctive name changing. They are not mostly, even if they show up in the files, they are not changing their names to eliminate a name for discrimination. They're doing it to honor a parent, or they're doing it for some other kind of reason that much more mimics what other people in the population are doing. And so I would argue that the state surveillance of Muslim and Arab names has been much higher than it was for Jews. But I wanted to end, and I sort of told Mohammed this is the one thing I'm kind of throwing in just in preparation for this talk that I wanted to kind of throw out that I thought was interesting. I was kind of looking through some recent texts about Islamophobia, and there's a recent book by Khalid Baidoun that sort of argues that there is something that you need to look at state discrimination, that you need to look at private discrimination, right? So you need to look at the government discriminating, right? Creating surveillance projects, right? You need to look at the private discrimination, like employers and schools not wanting to take people. And that he calls this kind of a dialectical Islamophobia, where there's an interaction, I think, between the private and the state. And that is actually, I would just want to say, is pretty similar to what I argue for my Jewish petitioners. Although actually with my Jewish petitioners, I argue that we need to expand how we see the state, right? The state is a lot of actors, including, you know, just a Navy officer who said connection between state and private. That might mean we need to think more broadly about state and state discrimination in the US. And think about the ways that it intersects with the private, and not sort of so much as privatized in the US, both consciously and also unconsciously, that I think it's really important to think about the ways that these things interconnect and interpenetrate. And the final thing that I just want to add you with, which is totally bizarre, which I just found yesterday looking through this, is an internet attack from some wacko crazy guy, Andre Savant, who is like an actor, a very minor league actor who showed up in a movie. And this guy, it's not clear whether he's actually a racist or just like literally like schizophrenic. It's not clear from reading his website, but he absolutely uses Savant's name changes from an Arabic sounding name to a not Arabic sounding name, and then back to an Arabic sounding name in 2012 actually, as a way of attacking him, right? And so I really want to encourage like that we think about the ways that both the private sector and also the public sector are using name changes as a way of identifying, targeting, and questioning the loyalties of people and racializing them fundamentally. So that's all I want to say. Thank you guys so much for your patience, and I'm really happy to talk with you with any questions that you have. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions.
Yeah.
Have you looked at other different ethnicities that have name changes to look at the comparison? I just find it really common for, like, say, Chinese who come in as visiting scholars to say, I'm Henry, I'm John.
Absolutely, yeah, I did look. So the great thing about the name change petitions, but also the complicated thing about them, is that everybody can use them. So I look at everybody, for sure, because they're all in there. So absolutely, yeah. So Chinese petitioners, I don't have the numbers with me, but I can absolutely access them for you after we do this. They are absolutely there. Not in quite as high percentages in this 2002, so this kind of broad spike, you know, in 2002. They're also not as disproportionate to their population, but they are still disproportionate. So yeah, Chinese absolutely do look like this. There are differences in the way they're doing it that I would argue are different both from how Muslims are doing it and how Jews are doing it, right? So they are almost, actually I'm going to say always, they are always choosing first names, right? So they're never choosing last names in a way that Jews and Muslims are changing both, right? Because both names kind of identify them. And Chinese, because I think they are less able to sort of pass occasionally as white, right? Like they are more, their facial features are much more identifying of them racially. They are less selecting, sort of thing. They are more sort of trying to acknowledge to people, yes, don't worry about me, right? I'm gonna pass, I'm going to be a good worker, it'll be easy to say my name, things like that. But they do not ever suggest that they are facing the kind of discrimination that Muslim Americans really clearly put in their petitions. So absolutely, I also look at Latinos as well. There's a lot of Latino name changing, which kind of goes back and forth in terms of adding mothers' last names and taking mothers' last names out, because that's a sort of Latino naming tradition that people either find is really a pain in American sort of bureaucracy and just makes life hard for them, or else they find that they sort of want to put that in because they want to honor their mothers, and they find there's no place for it. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question. So I do think that what you see for what Jews are doing and what Muslims are doing, there is more similarity there, but there are definitely, it's absolutely important that name changing sort of does emerge in these different populations. So you're absolutely right about that.
Can I speak in a question?
Sure, yeah.
You mentioned the surveillance in 2004. I wonder also if we could, I wonder if the candidacy in an election of Barack Hussein Obama, who's not Muslim, if that had something to do with this, with the decrease.
With the decrease, yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. He showed up, I had a picture of him in my last PowerPoint, I took it out for this one. I would sort of say that I sort of think that, I think that there is absolutely, and maybe I should have talked about it more here, there is, I think, a greater pride in people's names. I think that in my argument, I do tend to sort of focus on these kind of structural, either surveillance or, sort of getting jobs and things like that, because I think we're all really quick to kind of jump on the notion that we live in a world where a man like Barack Hussein Obama can be elected president. And so I tend to move away from that because I think that's our first assumption. We're also proud of our ethnic names now, that of course people are going to keep those names. But I do think it plays a role. I want to bring these other elements out because I don't think people think about them as much. But yes, absolutely, I think that's totally there. Yeah. Yes?
So I just had more of a question about your research with the Jewish name change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know you said you studied New York. How do you think the Catskills and how prominent they were during that time in New York? How do you think that affected the name change with the Jewish community?
So in terms of actors or people who are sort of famous comedians or whatever changing their names, is that what you mean? Or not needing to change their names, or that they, I don't look as much at entertainers. I certainly found entertainers in my petitions, if anybody's curious, I can let you know. There's all kinds of exciting people that I found. I don't find that many of them though, right? So, part of the argument that I try to make here is that we tend to think about entertainers changing their names, right? There's so many prominent ones, and that we assume, number one, we assume that's what they had to do to get ahead. And we also kind of assume that's what name changing was. There's way more secretaries and business people and med students and tax attorneys and salespeople doing this. And so I try to focus on that because I think that numerically they're larger. And also because I think we focus so much on sort of the glamour of name changing. And I want people to know this was an ordinary phenomenon that ordinary people like us did just in order to get a job. But those people are definitely there. And afterwards, if I can remember, I'll let you know some of the fun names if you're curious. Not so much Catskills folks, but Gene Wilder. That's probably the most famous one that you guys might know. I did find Gene Wilder. Yes?
So you said that in 2002, over 60% of names are erased in court after clear backlash?
No. Over 60% of the names, and this is really complicated, I don't blame you, I don't mean no in a bad way. A lot of the ways I say these things are very complicated because I'm doing a lot of different number running. It's 60% of the names that are submitted to say, oh, I want to get a job, I'm kind of embarrassed of my name, because people are changing their names for lots of other reasons, I hate my father and I don't want to have his name anymore, or I remarried, or my name on my birth certificate was wrong. There's a zillion other reasons, not a zillion, but there's definitely other names. So I blocked off in my methodology, I blocked off people doing it for ethnic reasons, and then 60% of the Muslims doing their names, changing the names, are doing it for that reason. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Is that helpful?
Yeah.
You just wanted to clarify? Okay, great. Yes?
You mentioned the cost that Jews had for things.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you go a little more into detail?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, and I don't talk about it even as much as I wish I did in my book, but I talk about it a little bit. Number one, there's tons of communal division. And actually, I don't know whether that exists in the Muslim community. If anybody knows, I'm actually really curious. So I write one chapter about like real battles within the Jewish community, as you know, people are very upset by people changing their names. There's a lot of sense that people changing their names are abandoning the Jewish community. You know, they're traitors. And that's painful, right? And it happens, you know, on playgrounds, people get teased, right? You know, friendship groups, you know, there's a lot of anxiety around this and a lot of intracommunal battles that I think is quite harmful to the Jewish community. And I think it's very painful to the people who change their names, right? I think they feel very damaged, so much so that I argue ultimately that they kind of obfuscate the reasons they change their names. So the history that I'm writing, a lot of people don't know about it, right? Because people don't talk about it because they're a little embarrassed or ashamed. And then I also think that there's a certain amount of loss, right? Like, so by today, I interviewed a few people who feel bad. I interviewed one person who changes her name back to her Jewish name. That doesn't happen that often. But there's more people who feel like, oh, I have this, you know, lopped off white name, right? That it doesn't mean anything. Like, I have a guy saying his name is Alan Gale, and it used to be, I think, Goldberg. And he's like, what's Gale? You know, like, what is that name? So I think that there's some pain in that kind of loss, you know, that individuals and family members feel. So does that make sense? Yeah.
And I can speak to that point.
Oh,
know,
yeah.
From the Muslim perspective,
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
tell you that I've heard numerous sermons, and I'm sure others too, where the person giving the sermon ridicules those who change their name from Muhammad to Mo or Mike. Numerous occasions, this is something others have heard.
That's
I've heard
really
on numerous
fascinating.
occasions I've heard that.
And that's happening in the Jewish community.
Right,
The exact
right.
same thing is happening in the Jewish community, and
Right.
that's going to make you feel bad, right?
Right.
And that's kind of
Yeah.
offering a lot of communal sort of power behind sort of, you know, disapproving of people who've made a choice, sometimes for very practical reasons, you know. That's really interesting to know that. Thank you. That's good to know. Yeah.
So you said you live in a time where people are taking more pride into claiming their ethnic identities. Do you think because when people change their names that has caused more negative effects on it, when it's like more, when people are doing it out of their own obligation? And by that I mean like my ancestors, because I identify as Native American, our last names were considered to be assimilated white names that were mandated by the
Yes.
United States government,
Yes.
which have caused more negative effects rather than positive.
That's a great question, and it is really, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, and maybe I should repeat it so I make sure I'm understanding the name correctly, because Native Americans were sort of mandated to take on names to take an allotment, right, to be able to get land, right? That actually in a lot of ways has a lot of comparison to Jews' names in Europe. So Jews' names are in part so distinctive and able to be identified because Jews take on last names later than all other Europeans, and they do so in a process that makes them citizens, gives them the rights of citizens, and requires them to take on these new names. Now, it doesn't hand them the names, it lets them choose the names for the most part, but nonetheless, in Jewish circles, that was actually something that I frequently got from people when I started doing my work. People would say, well, Jews don't care about these names. They were mandated, right? They were foisted upon them by immigration, by officials in Europe, right? Those names don't really mean anything to Jews. I hope I'm understanding you properly. I mean, from my perspective, and that's something that I did find in my research, that you know people would justify their name changing by saying this name isn't really a Jewish name. This name is something, you know, it's not really, you know, of my family, right? Somebody else gave it to me. And I guess I think that might be some reason why Jews might be more comfortable changing their names. But I also think that they had those names for a long time, and they are actually, and I don't know about this with Native American names, whether those names that were selected do identify people as Native American. Do you know?
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't, so they wouldn't identify them. So that's a little bit different.
Because like you mentioned how some Jewish and Muslim names are reverting back to the original names, it's just some Native American tribes or Native American individuals are trying to go back to like their clan names.
Is that right? Do you know numbers? Do you know how many people are doing that? I'm interested. Is it a lot, or is it like a real trend, or is it just maybe a couple of people you know?
It would depend on the selections of it, because it depends. There are over 600 reservations that are recognized, but I would say about half of them are trying to revert to that.
Really? That's really interesting. That's interesting. So not very many people revert back. And I argue, I don't know what this is like for Native American, I mean, I don't know how this works. I'd be interested. I argue that these names are still stigmatized. Still people don't really want to walk in someplace. It's still harder to go in and be Goldberg, right? You're still announcing that you're Jewish, right? And having to deal with people's stereotypes about you in a way that walking in someplace and being Gail gives you power, right? You can either tell people you're Jewish if you feel like it or not tell them. which is kind of the power of whiteness. I mean, the argument that I make ultimately that this is really about one way that Jews absolutely become white is having this name that gives them that power to be something or not. And that it's harder to go back to those names because of that kind of stigma. So I don't know if that, I mean, I'm interested to know that there are similar, I mean, I absolutely know about those similarities in terms of how people get their names, but I didn't know about I didn't know about the trend today, so I find that very, very interesting. There's not as much of it happening for Jews. There's a few. I interviewed one person, but there's not as much. So that's a good question. Yes?
I was just wondering, I don't know if it's easy to quantify this, but are there people that maybe try to either have themselves or their children like change the name more through the avenue of like marriage, by like marrying somebody with like a European name?
That's a really interesting question. I have wondered, so I have a friend who does work on Jewish intermarriage, and I remember talking to her about this. She said that she definitely, in doing oral histories with people, you know, sort of talking to people, that she did find some people who sort of thought one of the attractions of marrying somebody, you know, was that you got a different name. I don't think that there was any kind of like concerted effort to do that. And in fact, interestingly, I also found plenty of single women who you wouldn't expect in the 1930s, women who are expecting to get married and change their names within 5 years probably, who changed their names just because of what it would offer for them. So and I haven't seen anything. I mean, I don't know whether you know about the Muslim community, if you have any kind of sense, but I don't think so. I mean, in the Jewish community, there's such a strength towards, at this time, there's so much there's a lot of prohibitions against intermarriage, marrying outside of the Jewish community. So I don't think most people wouldn't want their kids to marry outside for a name. You know, they'd be unhappy about their kid marrying outside much more than they would care about the name. And in fact, one of the very few petitions I found of somebody who changed their name back to the Jewish name was a guy who wanted to marry a girl whose family was very, very religious and refused to let the marriage take place under the new name that he had. He had changed his name to Matthews. He had to go back to Shoeshine because it upset this family so much. You know, I'm going to take this off, and you don't need this wacko racist. Let's get him off the. Yeah, I'm all of a sudden realizing that's what you're looking at. That's awful. Let's get him away. Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned the proportion of Arab and Muslim names in New York City that were changed prior to 9/11, and
right after.
You said
yeah.
6% of the population and roughly 18%.
Yes, correct. 7% really, 6.6% Muslim, and then 1% Arab. Yes.
So I guess my question is, how about in the larger historical framework? What was the percentage of Arab and Muslim individuals changing their names prior to 9/11?
I mean, it varies, almost none. Right, so yeah, I mean, I didn't find, maybe one or two occasionally. I mean, they don't show up in the population in large numbers. I mean, you know, the 1965 Immigration Act opens doors much more to immigration from Middle Eastern countries. So you'll see more immigration after 65, so it's very minimal. They show up very, very minimally in the population. And Jews are showing up. Jews are like 25% of the population, but nonetheless, they're showing up in much larger numbers in these petitions.
And so in that 120-year period that you looked at, what's the largest groups that you continue to see?
Jews.
Okay.
And there's no question, this court is just dominated by Jewish names. There are others, so Italians, at various times Italians or people with sort of Slavic names, Polish, Russian names show up. There are German names after World War I, but really Jewish names are really the names that dominate in the years before 2001. After 2001, the population of New York City changes. The population of the name changes also, of these petitions also change, and that's something that I didn't really address, although I could if you would like me to get into more detail. Basically, it becomes cheaper to change your names. If you notice the difference is now you do it by yourself, you don't need to pay a lawyer. So you can do it much more easily even if you don't have money. So Jews were in part changing their names also because they were more middle class than a lot of other people, and so they had both the resources and they also were looking for jobs where people were surveilling them. It wasn't as true for working class and poorer people. Now, because you can do it by yourself without a lawyer, you can even get the fees waived to do it. It's much more representative of the larger population, and in fact, it's mostly poorer people who are doing it. I think in part because they are being surveilled more. They're being bureaucratic. They're being tripped up by bureaucracy more than middle class people.
So your research.
Sorry, that's probably more than you wanted to know.
Oh, no,
I
no.
apologize.
And then your research focused in New York City.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering about the pattern of Jewish name change in Middle America.
Yeah.
Compared to New York, that has its own dynamic.
So that is a really important question. I don't really know the answer to that. I can answer for you a little bit. I know that there were studies. So there's a study in LA in the 1950s that looked at the late 40s that absolutely found the same kinds of things I was finding, that Jews were way disproportionate in the name change petitions in LA. And then also there was a sociological study of Jews in Minneapolis that was published in the 60s, in the early 60s, and it was also finding, not necessarily that Jews were disproportionate, but that there were large numbers of Jews, particularly sort of middle class or upper middle class Jews who had changed their names. So there's at least some, and I have like anecdotal and I have correspondence and I have other things, so it's there, but I don't have, other than LA and Minneapolis, I don't really have numbers to match this one. I initially imagined this was going to be comparative, but it took me 6 years to write about New York, or excuse me, 12 years to write about New York, so it's better that I just stuck with New York. Thank you for the questions. Yeah?
So for the name change, when it comes to that, are the names that are changed going to be carried to others of their lives? Like, how will it affect the family, the family's term?
That's a great question. So if it's a surname, right, then it affects the entire family. And that's a part of, the women left who asked about the pain, but that's a part of the pain, right, is that it gets brought down to children and to grandchildren. Sometimes it's kept a secret from them that there was a name change, and so that can be very painful when they find out about it. That's the story that I tell in the epilogue of my book. And sometimes I just feel like somebody changed my name and I didn't know about it. So that absolutely does last. Interestingly, though, those families, if you remember, I said family petitions, because technically the children's names are not changed and the wife's names are not changed unless they go in and change them themselves. So that's why you see lots of families going in and doing this together, is that actually families really need to do it together. But like, if you have a child afterwards, it absolutely affects the family. The first name, less so. But I mean, I don't know if anybody here has ever changed their name. Getting somebody to call you by a new first name also creates stress and tension, right, in a family. So I didn't find much evidence of that, but I wasn't looking for it. I bet if you went looking for it, I bet you would find kind of anxiety and tension about that as well. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
You mentioned the state surveillance. I don't know if it's the right question, but I wonder how, especially after 9/11, with new agencies springing up, how much there's joint sharing between all the different agencies in targeting these individuals.
Well, I mean, certainly, it depends. You mean in terms of sharing the surveillance agencies' data? I would assume there was a lot of sharing. I mean, I'm assuming that they are looking, as they're looking at name change petitions, I assume they're sharing information. I don't know. There's a book, actually. So this stuff came out of reporters who published it in a book. So you could probably look for it, and they probably have a lot more information about sort of the sharing of it. But I was really struck by the fact that they openly said, we are not expecting to find anything. We are looking to scare people, right? That they actually say this in their in interviews, right? We're not really expecting to find much. We want to let people know we're watching, was kind of what they said. So I do think that there's probably sharing if they think there's danger, but I think it's also sort of, surveillance. It's being done to scare people from doing something, I think. Yeah. That's an interesting question. And certainly also the one other thing I want to say about sharing is that I was just kind of shocked that my agency shared the name change petitions with these agencies. I mean, it's open, right? I could do this. This stuff is open. These names are open, right? It's open access. Name changing, if you want to do it, you have to publish the information in a newspaper. I mean, it has to be a public process, right? So in that sense, it's not that surprising. But I guess I feel very protective of these files. I spent a long time in them. I got to know the people that, do the processing. I waited online with people who were changing their names. So I became a part of that office for the periods when I was there. And so I was kind of like, the answer I gave about bureaucracy. So you should know also when Jews fall down, when Jewish numbers go down in the 1960s, nobody's changing their names, period. The numbers seriously go down. So they're in the thousands in the 1940s when Jews are doing it. By the 1970s and 1980s, as Jews stop doing it, you get maybe 200 a year. It just goes down. And so people are doing it in very, very tiny numbers. There's just not a lot of people doing it. Because really this was this kind of middle class phenomenon that really enabled Jews to get a job. And once it's not, they don't work anymore, it goes down. These, after 2001, at the same time, like, so not really related to surveillance, is that they begin not making you need a lawyer, right? Making it open to more people without money, right? And putting it on the internet and not requiring a lawyer, which meant that it became open and democratic. So after 2001, you just also see thousands more. So in some ways, I can't really tell you about those 65 to 2001 years. Not much is happening. The numbers are very, very small, in part because it's still expensive to do it, right? And so people aren't doing it for these kind of middle class reasons that Jews were doing it, so people just aren't doing it very much. So you really don't see very many ethnic groups of any kind changing their names in huge numbers. And then you see this huge wave again after 2001. Might have something to do with Muslim Americans, but it has a lot to do with just the ways that they change their minds about how, or change the circumstances of how the petitions get done. Does that make sense? It's kind of an unsatisfying answer, I realize. It doesn't tell you everything, you know what I mean? Like when you're an historian, you gotta kind of rely on what the petitions are that they tell you. I don't know what classes you're in, but if you do social science, or even if I were gonna do oral histories, right? So another way to do this is go and interview people from Muslim American communities. Because I was looking at name changing, I was kind of limited to these documents, which can tell me certain things and they can't tell me other things, which are really good questions and a good thing to look for later.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Professor Fermaglich.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a great
And while I have your attention, I want to let you know we have a bunch of events coming up that may be of interest. Actually, our annual conference is coming up. It's going to be a couple weeks from now, and the theme is Education Under Siege, and we'll have flyers circulating soon. But if you want to get on our listserv, you can sign up outside. That's it for now. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Yes, thank you for
And
that.
let me know if you want to buy the book.
Yeah.
I can get you 20% off.
Actually, I have three questions.
Yeah.